The Chinese Communist Party's mouthpiece, People's Daily, suddenly published a signed article under the pen name Zhongsheng, trying to use historical guilt to tie Japan down and slap the current Japanese government with the big label of militarism, once again flashing the CCP's bottom line and red line. But this instead exposes what Xi Jinping fears the most: Japan's strategic course has changed. It no longer follows the CCP's World War II historical narrative and has long been a member of today's Western civilized world. Japan's refusal to back down has pushed the CCP to use its last move, military intimidation. The PLA's Central Theater Command, responsible for guarding the capital region around Beijing, released a video shouting slogans like, "Guns loaded and swords drawn, battle could start in the very next second." On the surface it looks like a pledge of loyalty, but it implicitly suggests starting a war right on Beijing's doorstep, something extremely inauspicious. Seeing the CCP's bottomless military threats, neighboring countries are keeping their distance from Beijing. Indonesia and Australia are about to sign a security treaty, and the purpose is precisely to guard against the CCP. The CCP's real goal in threatening Japan and Taiwan is not them, but the United States. The CCP wants to catch up with America in its nuclear arsenal, to make Washington hesitate and feel constrained if it tries to intervene militarily should the CCP attack Taiwan. Its deepening alignment with Russia further disperses U.S. attention and ties down American power. What's even more alarming is that the CCP is secretly buying huge amounts of gold and boldly experimenting with de-dollarization, preparing for a possible future war. What the CCP fears most. On November 17, the CCP's People's Daily ran a signed commentary under the name Zhongsheng on page 3, issuing a warning about Japan's strategic trajectory. Japan's new Prime Minister, Takaichi Sanai, triggered deep unease in Beijing with her Taiwan contingency remarks, and the CCP has been pressing Japan step by step. This party media commentary is trying to tightly bind Japan to the post-war documents such as the Cairo Declaration and the Potsdam Declaration, using morally coercive language like militarism to force today's Japan to obey the CCP's version of World War II history. The article claims that the Taiwan issue is at the core of the CCP's core interests and is an untouchable red line and bottom line. At the end, it demands that people of all countries in the world, including the Chinese people, must be prepared. This party commentary has at least two big problems. First, Japan is no longer the Japan of before World War II. With the help of the United States, Japan has undergone a transformation of values, a phoenix reborn from the ashes, and has long since become part of the advanced Western nations. Continuing to bind Japan with the outdated notion of militarism is completely out of touch with reality. Doesn't the CCP like to call itself advancing with the times? When it comes to Japan and Taiwan, the CCP has been left far behind by the era. Second, the CCP's mentality of acting as a representative is laid bare. The CCP can only speak for itself, it cannot represent the Chinese people, let alone represent the people of all countries in the world. The party media commentary is shameless to the extreme. Just trading barbs isn't satisfying to the CCP, so PLA theater commands have begun swearing loyalty. Fighting at Beijing's front door. Central Theater Command shouts, "Battle could begin in the next second." On the evening of November 17, PLA Air Force units under the Central Theater Command released a video saying, "Come on, the gun is loaded and the sword is unsheathed. We are ready at all times to win battles." The footage flaunted a large array of weaponry including J-20 fighter jets, accompanied by a song titled "Battle Could Begin in the Next Second" to ramp up the effect. The lyrics proclaim, "War could begin in the next second. Only if you win do you have the right to speak. No matter how much you talk, how well you speak, the battlefield will be the real test." The Central Theater Command's defense area mainly covers Beijing, the CCP's capital. Its shouting that war could begin in the next second is highly noteworthy. This seems to imply that war flames would spread to the Beijing region, which is extremely inauspicious from the CCP's perspective. As for all this "guns loaded and swords drawn" rhetoric from the PLA, Japan, as a modern, civilized nation, does not want to go to war with the CCP. Using diplomacy to solve problems is the mainstream of today's world. Japanese diplomats travel to China for talks. According to reports by Japan's NHK, Kyodo News, Fuji News Network and others, Masashi Kanai, Director General of the Asian and Oceanian Affairs Bureau at Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, traveled to China and is scheduled on the 18th to hold talks with Liu Jinsong, Director General of the Asian Affairs Department of the CCP's Foreign Ministry. Kanai is expected to convey that Japan's stance on Taiwan remains unchanged, in an effort to ease tensions between China and Japan. Japan's Chief Cabinet Secretary Minoru Kihara told the media that the CCP's warning actions do not match the direction for bilateral relations set by the leaders of the two countries. He pointed out that a PRC Coast Guard vessel had lingered for several hours on November 16 in the waters around the Senkaku Islands, Diaoyu Islands, in Japanese territorial seas. Regarding this patrol by CCP Coast Guard ships near the Diaoyu/Senkaku Islands, ROC, Taiwan, President Lai Ching-te said on November 17 that the CCP's hybrid attacks against Japan seriously undermine peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific region. He called on Beijing to show restraint and not become a troublemaker for regional peace and stability. Australia and Indonesia to sign security treaty. On November 12, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese met Indonesian President Prabowo Subianto in Sydney, and the two held a joint press conference afterward. Australia announced that it had reached agreement with Indonesia to sign a security treaty. In light of the CCP's increasingly aggressive maritime activities, it has become essential for Australia and Indonesia to deepen their relationship. Prabowo stressed in the press conference that this agreement will further strengthen bilateral ties, saying, "This is a commitment by the two countries to closer cooperation in the security field. Good neighbors are indispensable." The treaty is expected to be signed in Indonesia in January next year. Commenting on the upcoming Australia-Indonesia Security Treaty, Hung Pachau, Deputy Executive Director of the Center for China Studies and Regional Development at Tunghai University in Taiwan, wrote on November 17 that the two countries are sending a clear message. Faced with the CCP's expansion in the Indo-Pacific, Australia has chosen a tighter security posture, and Indonesia is willing to make itself part of the regional security architecture. Hung wrote that almost at the same time, Jakarta, which had previously said it would soon purchase PLA J-10 fighter jets, suddenly changed its tone, saying it was still considering the move. These may seem like two unrelated events, but together they send a very clear signal. Indonesia is deliberately telling the outside world that it will not stand on the CCP's side, nor will it allow any country to treat it as a predetermined political choice. The J-10 purchase story went from being publicized to being walked back in just a few weeks. Indonesia's defense minister first said the jets would soon arrive in Jakarta, then later said they were still under evaluation. At first glance this looks like procedural confusion, but seen from the broader angle of diplomatic and strategic calculation, it becomes clear that Indonesia is deliberately keeping its room for maneuver vague. For Indonesia, the J-10 deal has come under questions for being overpriced and much more complicated to integrate logistically than expected. The United States has also clearly signaled its opposition to Jakarta. These reasons are indeed real, but at the core is Indonesia's unwillingness to be tagged with a clear label in great power competition. Just as Indonesia is putting the J-10 on hold, Australia and Indonesia are strengthening their bilateral security ties. Put together, these developments make things clearer. The CCP thought it had locked in Indonesia, but in reality Indonesia is speeding up its alignment with Australia in another direction. The key to the Australia-Indonesia Treaty is not just symbolic cooperation, but institutionalizing and normalizing security interaction between the two. For Indonesia, this is a rare strategic lever. It can keep its economic ties with China while boosting its security links with the West. For Australia, Indonesia becomes a northern security anchor point. For Indonesia, Australia helps reinforce its southern strategic rear. Combined, they create an invisible but crucial defensive arc between the first island chain and the Indonesian archipelago. Indonesia is not a major claimant in the South China Sea, but China's 9-dash line encroaches right up to the edge of Indonesia's exclusive economic zone, EZ, creating real geopolitical pressure. On his first foreign trip after taking office, Prabowo stated publicly in Washington that Indonesia would always defend its sovereignty. That sentence was not primarily meant for the United States. It was said to China through the U.S. platform. Hung believes that from the U.S. Japan, Australia, Philippines Security Network, to the new Australia-Indonesia Treaty, and to Indonesia's political signal of pausing the J-10 deal, the Indo-Pacific geopolitical landscape is quietly drawing out a new southern line. This line stretches from the northern tip of the first island chain down across the Indonesian archipelago to northern Australia, forming a slowly emerging defensive arc. A farce that's hard to end. In other words, more and more neighboring countries are becoming like Indonesia, drifting further away from the CCP. Now, relations with Japan have been pushed to the absurd stage of guns loaded and swords unsheathed, with battle starting in the next second. The CCP's farce may not yet have reached its climax, but it is clearly becoming harder and harder to wrap up. On November 17, Japan's Ministry of Defense reported that a Chinese drone flew on the 15th between Yonaguni Island and Taiwan, prompting fighter jets of Japan's Air Self-Defense Force in the Southwest Air Defense Sector to scramble in response. The Joint Staff Office said the drone took off from the direction of the East China Sea, flew out into the Pacific Ocean and then turned back, crossing the sea area between Yonaguni Island and Taiwan. A troublemaker. The CCP is, without question, a troublemaker. It constantly stirs up incidents and escalates tensions with Japan. Behind all of this lies a clear objective: the United States. On November 17, Reuters reported in an exclusive that the CCP's export restrictions on rare earths are causing an increasing global shortage of the element yttrium, with consequences for aerospace, energy and semiconductor manufacturing. After a meeting in Busan, South Korea, between U.S. President Donald Trump and CCP leader Xi Jinping, industry had hoped for a stable supply of key materials. In reality, the dispute has not been fully resolved. Although the CCP has since suspended parts of its restrictions, the controls implemented in April remain in place. On April 4, China's Ministry of Commerce and General Administration of Customs announced export controls on 7 mid to heavy rare earth-related items, including samarium, gadolinium, terbium, dysprosium, lutetium, scandium and yttrium, as a response to Trump's reciprocal tariff measures. According to 4 rare earth traders and Eli Saklatvala, metals pricing director at commodities information provider Argus, these controls require exporters to obtain licenses from Beijing, making it difficult to export yttrium out of China. Saklatvala says that so far, most of the licenses issued have been for small shipments, and there are still long delays in moving raw materials. This has triggered a rush for yttrium, a situation that has lasted for months. Argus data shows that the price of yttrium oxide, used to make heat-resistant coatings, has risen 4,400% in Europe since January, reaching $270 per kilogram. In China, domestic prices are about $7 per kilogram, up 16% over the same period, but now starting to ease. The Aerospace Industries Association of America, AIA, says that yttrium is one of the key materials in the world's most advanced jet engines. Beyond aircraft engines and semiconductors, yttrium coatings are also used in gas power plants to protect turbine blades from high temperatures. On November 16, U.S. Treasury Secretary Bessent said in an interview on Fox News, Sunday Morning Futures, that she hopes a rare earth agreement between the U.S. and China can be reached before Thanksgiving. Bessent said she believes Xi Jinping will honor the deal. U.S. Thanksgiving falls on the 4th Thursday of November each year. This year it is on November 27. Bessent also warned that if Beijing goes back on its word, the United States has many tools to retaliate. The U.S. faces 2 nuclear rivals, China and Russia. On November 17, the Wall Street Journal reported that as a new nuclear arms race emerges, the United States must face 2 great nuclear rivals at once, Russia and China. The CCP used to have only a small nuclear arsenal, but it is now catching up quickly. Russia, meanwhile, is developing multiple new systems aimed at U.S. cities. Russian President Vladimir Putin has used nuclear threats to try to limit U.S. support for Ukraine. He has deployed nuclear weapons in Belarus and in recent weeks has tested a nuclear-powered missile and a nuclear-powered unmanned underwater vehicle, which he claims can evade U.S. defense systems. Russia and the United States are still observing some arms control limits, such as the New START Treaty, which will expire in February. But China, without any such commitments, is quietly but rapidly advancing. According to U.S. estimates, by the mid-2030s, the CCP's deployed nuclear warheads will be roughly on par with the U.S. Russia and the CCP appear to be growing ever closer, and their tightening ties bring unprecedented strategic uncertainty to the United States and its European and Asian allies. Matthew Kronig, director of the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center and a former Pentagon official, said, "The current trend is to build up nuclear arsenals, not reduce them," and added, we are entering a third nuclear age, one that will look more like the Cold War than the 1990s and 2000s. Former President Trump has said he seeks nuclear reductions, but he cannot reduce U.S. warheads if America's adversaries do not do the same. Last month, he even called for a resumption of nuclear testing. According to the Federation of American Scientists, the U.S. currently has 5,117 nuclear warheads, including 3,700 in retired stockpiles. Russia has 5,459, and China has 600. The U.S. has not conducted an explosive nuclear test since 1992. North Korea is a new nuclear-armed state, having reached a formal military alliance with Russia last year. It is estimated to possess 50 nuclear warheads and is heavily investing in intercontinental missiles and submarine capabilities that can strike the U.S. homeland. Vipin Narang, director of the MIT Center for Nuclear Security Policy, believes the U.S. pays too much attention to Russia's nuclear arsenal and not enough to China and North Korea. He warns that if there is a regional conflict in Europe and China decides to seize Taiwan, and our forces are spread too thin, this would be a situation the U.S. is not yet prepared for. According to U.S. intelligence, Xi Jinping has ordered the PLA to be ready by 2027 to seize Taiwan by force if necessary, although that does not mean he will act soon. U.S. and NATO military commanders say that if war breaks out over Taiwan, the most likely scenario would be a simultaneity problem. The CCP's actions could trigger Russian military moves against one or more NATO members, and potentially a North Korean invasion of South Korea. At present, the CCP shows no interest in any arms control talks, because it wants to catch up with the US and Russia. Zhou Bo, a retired PLA senior colonel, former director of the Defense Ministry's Center for Security Cooperation, and now a senior fellow at Tsinghua University in Beijing, says the key issue is that the US worries it may lose a conventional war. Some people have even suggested using nuclear weapons against China in the Taiwan Strait. Therefore, in his view, the CCP should expand its nuclear arsenal, not necessarily to reach full parity, but to a level where the US would not dare even think about using nuclear weapons against China. Then, in a conventional war, the CCP could win. Is the CCP secretly buying gold to prepare for war? On November 14, the UK's Financial Times reported that this year, the CCP's central bank has reported very small official gold purchases, 1.24 tons in September, 1.9 tons in August, 1.9 tons in July, and 2.2 tons in June, for a total of 25 tons so far this year. Jeff Curry, chief energy strategist for private equity giant Carlyle Group's Energy Path, said, as part of its de-dollarization strategy, China is buying gold. He admitted that he would not try to guess exactly how much gold the CCP's central bank has bought, because this isn't like oil, you can track oil with satellites. With gold, you can't. There's no way to know where the gold goes or who is buying it. Yuichi Bruce Ikemizu, a director at the Japan Bullion Market Association, said, this year, people really don't trust official data, especially data from China. Ikemizu believes China's current gold reserves are close to 5,000 tons, twice the officially reported figure. Some media outlets have noted that in the 15th Five-Year Plan, 2026 to 2030, announced in October, the word prudent was removed. In previous 5-year economic plans, Beijing had always emphasized prudently advancing the internationalization of the renminbi. The CCP now seems to be boldly pushing ahead with a de-dollarization experiment, and this is very likely preparation for a scenario in which it launches a war and is sanctioned by the United States and the broader Western world. It is accelerating its gold accumulation as part of that preparation.